Okay, so I have a small problem. I just finished this workspace, which I am so excited about, but I have nowhere to put all of my stuff. I have these awesome work surfaces, but they really don't have any storage whatsoever. Not to mention, I need to get organized in here because it is a total mess. Oh, goodness. So I think I can feed two birds with one scone with an idea that I have. I'm not good at making furniture, but I think what I can do is take a few of those cube shelves that you see from like Ikea or on Amazon and actually turn it into an island. Use it as like the base of a work island so that I get the storage I need. I get more workspace that I can use for all my projects. And I can also make it movable so that I don't have to really figure out where it needs to live right out of the gate. I can build it and then move it around my space as I need to. Okay, so before we go any further, I need to actually clear some space on the floor so that we can start to lay this thing out. Now, I actually just got these cube shelves from Amazon that are kind of like IKEA shelf ripoffs as far as I can tell, but IKEA wasn't delivering to our area for some reason. So let's clear this off and start unboxing these cube shelves that we can use as the basis or the frame of this work island that we want to build. A quick note before we get started though, if you're wondering how we got to this point in the space that you see here, I'm gonna link the first part of this video series up in the corner of this video so that you can start there if you want to see all of the steps that we took to turn this space into what it is today before we start on this build. To form the sides of this work island that will feature all the storage that I mentioned earlier, I'm using two shelves that are 3x3 configuration and one shelf that's going to form the front of the work island, which is a 3x4 configuration. Generally, these were pretty easy to put together. You just first have to slide together the insides of each of the shelves, and then you can attach the outside of the shelf frame. I won't pretend like these are super high quality shelves or super robust, but I think 3 of them combined will provide a pretty robust base for this work island. As a last step to put the shelves together, you just have to attach the backs of the shelves, which surprisingly were actually pieces of thin wood rather than that sort of cheap cardboard material that you see in many of these sorts of shelves. Then I just had to repeat this process 2 more times. Next, it was time to configure them in this U shape to get the overall dimensions of what will become the base of the work island. Then, to start to connect everything together, me and my assistant started to bring in all the lumber that we were going to need for this project, which, all things considered, was actually pretty minimal. I mean, all said and done, we're talking about some pieces of trim and a few 2x4s and a sheet of plywood.
Crab, be a crab, follow me. Be a crab, follow me. Go, 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 go.
Next, it was time to cut down the 2x4s to the appropriate size to form the base of this work island. Now that we have the shelves assembled here, the next step that I'm thinking about is how to create some sort of frame that goes along the bottom that we can mount both some kind of bottom trim to hide these caster wheels that we're then gonna mount to this frame. So that when you look at this thing, it's actually gonna look pretty finished, I think. So let's get into creating this frame, attaching it to the shelves, attaching the trim, and then seeing if we can actually get this thing to stand on its own. To ensure that each side of the frame was held together securely, I just used these pocket holes using a Craig jig. I then did my best to make sure that these were square so that it would line up perfectly with the shelves. And just a quick note here, I actually did this strategically so those gaps you see between the outside and inside edges of the 2x4 frame and the shelves should all be the same so that when I attach the trim, it looks really uniform. I could then actually screw the shelves together using some pilot holes and these cabinet screws. These weren't intended to be structural necessarily, but just enough to actually keep the assembly together while I attach the bottom frame and then eventually the top countertop. I could then use these same cabinet screws to attach the frame to the shelves. The caster wheels went on next, which I measured strategically to make sure that they could rotate 360 degrees without hitting that trim, which is why you see that there. And here you can see my impeccable squat form that I used to get this thing propped upright and eventually flipped over onto the caster wheels. Once it was upright, I could actually test the caster wheels and they worked out perfectly. You'll see those little clamps that I put on the top just to try to make sure that this stayed together a little bit better while I worked on the countertop. Now this countertop is actually just one sheet of 4x8 Baltic birch plywood that I picked up from my local lumber yard. I then borrowed my neighbor's track saw to cut down the edges of this to the appropriate size. This was my first time using a track saw rather than just a standard circular saw, and it was so nice to get this cut down to size. Once the sheet was the appropriate size, I could then attach the countertop to the shelves using the same cabinet screws, sized just right so that they didn't poke through the top. I could then roll the shelves outside again and attach the remaining trim pieces around the outside of the plywood piece to act as a faux edge to actually make the countertop look thicker than it actually is. And rather than sanding these edges, I actually just took the track saw again around the edges to get a nice flat edge that I could eventually attach some edge banding to. However, before attaching any edge banding, I wanted to make sure that everything was sanded down nice and smooth. I won't pretend like I had a lot of strategy when I was attaching this edge banding, and this was really my first time doing this. So what I really did was just went back and forth with an iron, using a scrap cut off from the plywood to press against the edge of this to try to get it adhered really securely to the edge of the plywood and the trim piece that I had just attached. I then used a razor blade to cut down the edges close to the countertop, but not completely flush, because I would then come back with one of these dedicated tools to run along the edge banding to actually get it nice and flush with the bottom and the top of the countertop. I then went back over one more time with the iron to make sure that all the edges were nice and adhered all the way around. Couple that with another round of sanding, and it was starting to look pretty nice. It was then time to prep the countertop surface for some water-based polyurethane satin finish that I picked up from the same lumber yard that I got my plywood from. Note to self, all I had was these little sponge brushes here to apply this polyurethane with, but if I were to do this again, absolutely get a roller or a brush or something better, because this took a lot longer, and I'm pretty sure I didn't even get a uniform finish in the end, but it still looks really nice, and I feel like it does have a nice protective layer now, so I don't have to totally baby this countertop. That was really only possible because I went back through and applied 4 coats of this, sanding in between with 220 grit sandpaper. Hey y'all, this is John from the future, just butting into the middle of this video to say, if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel, because not only does it help this sort of content appear in people's feeds, it also is a massive motivator for me to continue posting about these sorts of projects. I have a ton more planned and I can't wait to share it with everyone here. So without further ado, let's get back to the video. In between applying coats of that polyurethane, I actually took the shelves back inside of the workshop so that I could apply the trim around the bottom. This is just using some select pine board from Home Depot because it's what I had easily available to me. Not only that, but it kind of matches the countertop, so it looks somewhat intentional. The final step here was to go back over the countertop one more time with some super fine sandpaper to make sure that we ended up with a buttery smooth finish on the countertop. This is where I could buff out all those scratches and scuff marks that you see here. And just like that, we have a fully finished island with tons of storage for our studio space. And to be completely honest, I bet someone could build this thing in about a day if they had all the materials and they didn't have a small child to look after. Using these pre-built shelves as the base of this thing, I think is what really saved me a ton of time. But obviously, you could use plywood and build these yourselves and it would be way sturdier. However, there's still one thing missing. Yeah, that small part storage, that'd be nice. These bins off of Amazon just happen to fit perfectly in these shelves, so I could put two to a shelf and then use it so I could grab any small parts that I need to pull for projects, bring them out, and then I can set them back once I'm done. This island is great because you can either stand at it or use some bar height stools to sit. Okay, so that's gonna do it for part 2 of this garage renovation series. Now make sure to follow along for part 3, because that's when we're gonna put all of the finishing touches on the space and do a final walkthrough so you can see where we started to where we're gonna end up. And then after that, the real fun can begin with all of the projects that I have in mind for this space. As always, thank you so much for watching.